It seems clear that psychedelics and psychedelic experiences have spiritual and philosophical dimension. This study from 2006 by Griffiths and others very much signaled the oncoming current psychedelic renaissance. And to the concern of some, its title contained terms like mystical and spiritual and high personal meaning. Mystical experiences have been shown to well predict the therapeutic outcome of psychedelic-assisted therapy and have been hypothesized, at least, to be the therapeutic mechanism of this therapy. These mystical experiences often provide some form of insight, that is, information about some kind of object. Most often these objects include things like God, the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, soul, angels, afterlife, and so on and so on. Apart from providing some insights, these experiences have also have this peculiar quality that William James called noetic. And he described it this way. Although so similar to states of feeling, mystical states seems to those who experience them to be also states of knowledge. They are states of insight into depths of truth unplumbed by the discursive intellect. They are illuminations, revelations, full of significance and importance, all inarticulate though they remain. And as a rule, they carry with them a curious sense of authority for aftertime. In other words, when you have a spiritual insight that has this noetic quality, it seems to be true. It seems to be real, and oftentimes more real than normal current waking reality. And there may lie a problem. Because mysticism and spirituality have clear supernatural and theological associations and connotations, at least in the minds of many. But respecting scientific worldview and being loyal to the scientific method seems to commit one to naturalism. That is the view, as Gabriela mentioned, that everything that exists is natural, that perhaps science is the most reliable way to find knowledge about reality, and that supernatural entities simply don't exist. And the curious sense of authority is often accompanied by a sense that what was revealed, the nature of the insight, is in some sense paradoxical or contradictory or outside of the discursive intellect. So these insights tend to be revelations, illuminations, not acquired through any scientific reasoning or common sense reasoning. We also have reasons to believe that psychedelic experiences, these powerful mystical and spiritual experiences, change people's philosophical views, so-called metaphysical views, personality traits, and values. And at least from work done by Jussi Ilkka and Aila Mustamo, we also know that many Finnish psychedelic researchers also have had self-experience with psychedelics.
International.
Sorry, international. So we are not immune to the powerful effects of psychedelics and the curious sense of authority that spiritual insights carry with them. And there are those who see this as deeply problematic. So Sanders and Zillmans think that there is an elephant in the room of psychedelic conference rooms, psychedelic therapy rooms. They write, as we see, there is an elephant in the room of modern psychedelic science. In scientific journals and throughout the halls of any psychedelic conference, researchers and therapists teach the importance of mystical experiences for the efficacy of psychedelic therapies. And not just that, they use in their work terms like ultimate reality, cosmic consciousness, and Gaia, and many, many others. And they contend that this is not clearly empirical, this is not clearly secular, this is not clearly naturalistic, and sounds like kind of theology. And they recommend that this whole emphasis on mysticism in psychedelic research just damages the field and should be abandoned. So for those who really want to be loyal to the scientific method, those who take psychedelics and believe in the spiritual insights that they carry, they may seem simply unscientific. And if they also press on some kind of spiritual insight that is supposed to be extra-rational, non-discursive, or ineffable, they may also seem to them just irrational. So our aim is to acknowledge the problem, first of all, to try to articulate what is the cause of this problem and propose some ways to diffuse the tension and find a way for both the scientific loyalists and the spiritual enthusiasts to find a modus vivendi. One of the concerns of Sanders and Zillmans and others is that people in psychedelic science do not really define their problematic terms, such as those terms that I've mentioned, ultimate reality and others. So we would like to define spirituality as best as we can as a connection or relation that gives one's life or seeks purpose and meaning, whether this is to the divine, God, a higher power, a transcendent reality, other people, oneself, nature, beauty. The objects can be numerous. Mysticism, we understand as a kind of spirituality that has as its object mystery. And mystical experiences we understand to be a kind of spiritual experiences. What they all have in common is a high felt sense of meaning. Like, this is tremendously important for me, what I'm just now experiencing. But they differ, mystical experiences, by mostly being about the self and often involving experiences of ego dissolution, self-loss, or unitary experiences. So how could spirituality threaten one's scientific standing? Because there seems to be some kind of tension between what psychedelics seem to try to convince us of and proper scientific study of psychedelics. Where could be the problem? Some authors have suggested that the problem might be what we call guruization. So long ago, Daniel Friedman worried that psychedelics have an aura of cultishness and magic about them and have potentially cultogenic effects. And this worry about cultogenic effects is not entirely unfounded. More recently, Matthew Johnson wrote that scientists or clinicians might perhaps without explicit awareness fall into the trap of playing guru, a priest, a spiritual leader. I trust you recognize Ramdas, Baba Ramdas on the picture, also known as the servant of God, or Richard Alpert, and also more recently, Hughes and others worry that psychedelic researchers could sometimes have what we might call excess enthusiasm for psychedelics, suggesting that they might have a bias for psychedelics or for their own spiritual teaching. And in the past, at least in the case of Timothy Leary and Walter Pahnke, it seems that this kind of enthusiasm and possible bias has led to outright scientific fraud, and at least to the blurring of the line between research use of psychedelics and recreational use of psychedelics, and also between researchers and research participants. So it seems there might be a tension. between one's role of a scientist and one's role of a guru or a spiritual leader. It seems there have been at least cases in the past where the guru have become, so to speak, uncritically enthusiastic about psychedelics or about some spiritual insight, and for this reason might have acted in a way that's not entirely in line with scientific integrity. Also, if Matthew Johnson's allegation in the paper that is quoted there are correct, then this might have led, I stress, to a kind of proselytization of spiritual views within one contemporary high-profile research group into psychedelics. By proselytization, we mean that some kind of spiritual views by the researchers or the therapist might have been foisted to the research participants and the patients, thus violating their right for autonomous thought, as Gabriela discussed just before me. We also stress that although we recognize completely that it may be tremendously important to discuss spiritual matters during the course of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, there is a difference between helping the patient to form his own views and foisting them or forcing them into accepting my own spiritual views and interpretations of these experiences. That's one way, potential way, that psychedelic spirituality might erode scientific integrity. Another much less serious and also less direct way could be if one slides from doing proper science into doing something like esoterics or philosophy, perhaps. So these are quotes from Stanislav Grof. You can find many other like this in his works in holotropic states, which are supposed to be mimicking psychedelic states, of course. We can experience in remarkable detail all the stages of our biological birth, memories of prenatal existence, and even a cellular record of our conception. Or this work brings strong evidence suggesting, in the last analysis, each of us is commensurate with the totality of existence. Now, from scientific point of view, what Grof is saying would likely be considered highly implausible. But perhaps if we wanted to be charitable, we could interpret quotes like these and positions like these, not literally, but in some esoteric or philosophical way, and thus give it much more credibility. Perhaps there is a way to interpret these quotes and others such that they really make sense. But that's not the point. The point is that this kind of esoterics, or philosophy in better case, is presented as scientific work, as conclusions of scientific investigations for which there is strong evidence. This, we believe, might be the second way in which a psychedelic spirituality might sort of threaten one's scientific integrity. Of course, we stress there is nothing wrong with doing philosophy. I myself am a philosopher. Our point is that it might be problematic if it's covertly done and presented as science mistakenly. Also, we'd like to stress that in our view, there's nothing wrong with being a guru, per se. We would just like to stress that there might be a tension between one's role of a guru and one's role of a scientist. And in conclusion, although it seems to us there is this tension and potential danger, we think the threat is not really serious. This is because there are many spiritual and religious scientists in the world, very good scientists, whose scientific integrity and good work doesn't seem to be threatened in any way by their spiritual and religious beliefs. But possibly there may be some very special pharmacological effect of psychedelics that is special just to psychedelics that causes this, but that is a claim that would have to be somehow proven or shown, which has not yet been done to our knowledge. Also, so in conclusion, there is no need, in our view, to censor in any way what psychedelic researchers can or cannot believe in their personally. what kind of spiritual or philosophical views they can form and have, but simply be aware of the danger of the uncritical enthusiasm or the guruization. I also haven't mentioned that one of our reasons for suspecting that this guruization effect is in place is really anecdotal. This is from Czech Republic, from training of psychedelic sitters who are repeatedly warned not to become a guru because it seems it's very easy to become overly impressed with one's own therapeutic success and one's own power that psychedelics give during psychedelic therapy. And if this kind of behavior, is a consequence of poor integration of psychedelic experience, such as ego inflation or spiritual bypassing, then this extenuates the need to understand the process of integration better and how to achieve good integration. Now, let's leave the realm of professional ethics and get deeper into the issue. Suppose there are two camps of people, the skeptics and the enthusiasts, and they differ in their answers to these two key questions. One, are spiritual and scientific worldviews compatible? Two, can we trust spiritual insights and adopt spiritual worldview? In other words, are these things that psychedelics are showing me true? Can I trust this? Can I believe this? The skeptics are going to start by adopting scientific worldview, by being loyal and respectful to the scientific method. They're going to perceive a tension between scientific and spiritual worldviews. And because they are loyal to the scientific method, they are going to infer that spiritual insights must be false, that belief in them cannot be warranted. The enthusiasts, on the other hand, are going to start by trusting spiritual insights. They're also going to perceive a tension between these two worldviews, and they are going to struggle. They are either going to have to reject in some way some part or whole of the scientific worldview, or they would have to find some way to resolve the tension between the two. And from the point of view of the skeptics, the enthusiasts are really anti-science, and that may even be deluded. But from the point of view of the enthusiasts, the skeptics are dwelling on a cold scientific picture of the world that is devoid of meaning. As an example that comes to mind is Alex Rosenberg's so-called disenchanted naturalism. These are the philosophical implication of thoroughgoing scientific worldview. And in his view, there is no God, there is no soul, there is no afterlife. Nothing is good, nothing is right. Love is illusion. Everything you might find valuable is either illusory or false. And if you don't like it, take antidepressants. Okay? This is what he says, I'm not making that up. But let's look, to resolve the issue, to try to resolve the issue at least, let's look at the objects of spiritual experiences. These are some examples, but they are pretty representative. For as long as I can remember, I have believed in God. But until the Good Friday experiment, I had no direct personal encounter with God. This is what Houston Smith said during the Good Friday experiment. Or, she examined herself and found that she finally did accept this to be true, which propelled her into a state of profound self-acceptance and well-being. She later said, all there is love. This is all that you are. This is all that matters. Or finally, for a few seconds, it was just like, I'm me, and there are no defining characteristics. That made me realize that I am not a smoker. After which the person was able to get rid of his tobacco addiction. So notice the objects. God, all there is love. We would say that the object is of value or what matters. And I'm not a smoker. Something about personal identity of the person. And this is really telling about the nature of spiritual and mystical insights, that the questions that they raise, the things they are about, are usually something like this. Is there a God? Is everything really one? Is there an afterlife? Who am I and why am I here? Is the self real? What matters most? What gives life meaning? What is the nature of reality? And how does mind relate to matter? But many others. But notice the nature of these questions. If you take, for example, who am I and why am I here? This seems like a highly personal question. It concerns the personal history, emotional life, and the personal identity of the person who has it. What matters most, what gives life meaning, could be viewed as a normative question, as a question of ethics. And the remaining question about God, everything being one, that is monism, also nature of reality and nature of consciousness, are not scientific questions. They are philosophical questions. These questions are not well-formed research projects. And none of these questions are in the purview of science. Science does not care about your personal identity and who you really are. It doesn't investigate questions like, is love really all that matters? And other questions like this. So this suggests that the controversy is not scientific, it's philosophical. And it could be bracketed as philosophical. There need not be any scientific controversy. And I'm not saying that these questions have no answers, that by bracketing these questions as philosophical, we are sort of putting them aside and making them, seeing them as making no sense. I myself am a philosopher. I have views on these questions, and I think they have better and worse answers. But whatever the conclusions we might reach philosophically, they are going to be more tentative and much less certain than proper scientific conclusions, which should give us a bit of humility in answering them. So our second suggestion for working scientists is to adopt methodological agnosticism. This is the attitude of holding such question in abeyance in one's scientific work. In other words, withholding judgments about whether any of this is true or false, and continue working on science, because science has very little bearing on answering these questions. Now, there is a possibility that the tension between scientific and spiritual worldview may be a bit overblown. So it seems that the main point of contention between these two worldviews is naturalism, view Gabika already defined. This is what seems to make scientific and spiritual worldviews incompatible. But if you look at the objects of some of spiritual insights and spiritual living, you find that they don't require any talk about supernatural or theological or non-natural entities. Often, people find spiritual meaning and purpose in nature. What is supernatural about nature? In beauty, in scientific ideas themselves, in selfhood, in values such as the insight about love and in other objects. So it seems at least possible that there could be a naturalistic spirituality that is a point of view which accepts and has respect both for science and for at least some spiritual insights without compromises. This, of course, doesn't mean that all spiritual insights could be made compatible with scientific worldview. Many of them are going to be incompatible. We're simply saying that spirituality is not necessarily supernaturalistic. And to the point of that, there may be a problem of interpretation. One of you had a question about this. So when we read psychedelic reports and people write about God, mystical interpretations, and afterlife, these might not be necessarily understood as supernaturalistic. For instance, some people understand God as part of one's own self or as being identical to nature. If you are a mystic and you identify with everything, then the death of your body and your mind is not your end. And in that way, you can believe in afterlife without positing existence of any supernatural secondary realm where your body will live. Also, claims of transcendental reality as a radically different may be simply a way of saying that the way I perceived this existing reality was so different from the normal way of perceiving it that it merits the metaphor of a different world. So in conclusion, these key questions about the controversy can be bracketed as philosophical. Perhaps there is a need to understand the process of psychedelic experience integration. And our two main proposals are for researchers to professionally maintain their scientific integrity by remaining methodologically agnostic, critical and honest. But personally, psychedelic researchers, we propose, should be free to adopt or disregard any spiritual beliefs. And my very final point, don't forget about ineffability. So Jane Dunlap wrote, "The colossal egotism of anyone who thinks he can write an LSD report. It can't be done. Not with all the languages in the world. And I understand that many of you ask your research participants to describe their experiences, because how else are you going to work with those experiences? But maybe this cannot be done. One of the classical features of mystical experiences is ineffability. And this feature doesn't get a lot of attention for understandable reasons. But suppose, for the sake of argument, and take ineffability seriously. Suppose mystical insights really are ineffable. They cannot be described in language. In that case, there are no spiritual sentences, no spiritual propositions that could be true or false, that could be compatible or incompatible with scientific sentences. Therefore, the whole issue makes no sense. The question whether these insights are true and compatible with science is based on false presupposition. It's a pseudo problem. And in that way, also, the air could clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. We have time for a couple of questions.
Thank you so much. Very important presentation. Very nice to hear. It reminded me one of the book. I think it's by Jason Ananda Storm. It's called The Myth of Disenchantment, meaning that the magic was never disenchanted from the world. You know, that there was never a shift from the mysticism, esotericism to skeptical science, but rather it was always hand-in-hand relationship, meaning that mystical thoughts was always going together with the science, like various figures, thinkers, you know, from Jung to Nietzsche, always had various beliefs in maybe supernaturalism and so on. And what do you think about the statement that that maybe there is more room in for the magic in the scientific discussion, you know, when we talk about just everyday rational, you know, things that people do? And also, do you think, is there a room for a new paradigm, meaning that there could be included both rationalism and irrationalism in, you know, scientific research?
I'm skeptical about including magic and irrationality within science, but I have at least hope in the naturalistic spirituality, and the hope that at least some spiritual insights, some form of spirituality that give life meaning, may be compatible with thoroughly scientific worldview. This is the view of E.O. Wilson and William James, that perhaps with time, spirituality and science can inform each other, and in time we can find how they relate to each other and how their connection is explained. So I don't know about magic and irrationality, but my hope is for spirituality. But many spiritual insights are going to have to be disregarded. Not all would have to be accepted in this view, just like the disenchanted naturalist philosophy would have to be disregarded as well.
Final question.
Thank you. I was wondering how specific you think these issues are related to spirituality and psychedelics. So I was thinking that, well, people do have, first of all, in different walks of life, people become gurus without any spiritual background. So you might be a scientist, hard-nosed scientist guru or you might be an exercise guru or a music guru and so on. So sort of the phenomenon of becoming a guru, that seems to be a universal pattern wherever there's some sort of social status. Some people will rise up to be a guru, whatever their sort of content of beliefs is. And the other one, on the other side, whether it's specific to spiritual beliefs, it could be the similar pattern for cultural beliefs, political beliefs, social attitudes, and so on. So people do have, clinicians and so on, they have a lot of specific cultural beliefs about family systems and so on, that they probably somehow communicate or transmit to people as well. So it might not just be spiritual, and it might not just be the kind of psychedelic guru. It might be a more universal pattern that we observe in many other walks of life.
Yes, of course, there are many forms of what we call in our paper insincere spirituality. There is, in our view, sincere spirituality, sincere human seeking for meaning. And there are many, many, sadly, forms of insincere spirituality, gurus, business gurus, and other people like that. The reason why we talk about spirituality in psychedelics specifically is that we think that this generates a special problem in relation to science. That is the tension between what psychedelics convey, the spiritual insights, and one's work as a scientist studying those very substances that give us this insight. So that's perhaps what's specific in my mind.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.